get you wired up. Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's my pleasure to welcome Bill Emmett to the school. And also, lest I forget, to plug his new book, which I actually have read, and it is quite fascinating, 2021 Vision, 20th Century Lessons for the 21st Century. Bill is a editor-in-chief of The Economist, for any of those you think who may be in the wrong room and want to leave now. There is an overflow room, I think 140, which is a tribute to both Bill and to the Journal. The Economist has grown by more than 2/3 during the 10 years that he's been editor-in-chief. And as somebody said, it's now one of the top British brands, like the Beatles and the BBC and the royal family. And like all those British brands, it's been widely embraced by Americans. Indeed, I think it's true that The Economist has more, I think you told me once, The Economist has more readers in America than in Britain, and raises an interesting question that Alex Jones suggested, which is, why don't we have our own Economist?
No, don't ask that.
In any case, we do have the one that comes across the ocean, and we're very, very grateful to Bill for that. He is a graduate of Oxford, Magdalen College, did a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics, and he covered European affairs in Brussels, and then went to Tokyo in a period when the conventional wisdom was that Japan was the rising superpower. You remember the quip from around 1990 or so, the Cold War is over and Japan has won. At that time, when everybody was taking that view, Bill wrote a book called The Sun Also Sets, Why Japan Will Not Be Number One. I happened to have read it at the time and thought, this is the best analysis I've seen. And it can only be repeated by this new book. So we're going to have a discussion conversationally for about 25 minutes or so, and then turn it over to the audience for questions and answers to try to get at some of the key questions that are in this book and behind the headlines of The Economist. I should say that to start off, Bill characterizes his politics or his vision in the book as that of a paranoid optimist. And I guess the obvious thing to ask you is, why paranoid and why optimist?
Well, first of all, thank you, Joe, for having me here today, and thank you all for coming. And thank you for your kind introduction and promotion of my book. Why paranoid and why optimist? Well, let me first of all explain that the expression came to me from a winemaker friend of mine who said that in his part of the wine business, they always feel optimistic that this year's vintage is going to be better than the previous one, and that it's just going to be perfect. And indeed, over time, they have improved. But every year, they're just worried that it's going to rain at the wrong time, the sun's not going to come out, maybe a disease will come. So they're also paranoid. But the long-term trend is progress and improvement, even if the vintages go up and down. And that's my view about where we are politically and economically in the world. I think the case for optimism is strong. Foundations of the post-Cold War world with globalization, spreading adoption of more or less market economics in more and more countries, the acceptance that this is the way to proceed, even if you need to regulate carefully, is a very positive thing. The waves of technological change that we're living through, which I think are long-term phenomena, are very positive things. And I believe America's position of leadership is a very positive thing, compared with periods in the past when we've had ambiguous leadership in the world, and that's led to insecurity and conflict. So I take comfort from America's position. I take comfort from the general spread of capitalism. But one must also realize that there are things that can come along to disturb this happy picture, and that's why I'm paranoid. That indeed I think that the state of paranoia is necessary to try to achieve the optimistic scenario that we need to come to, because we need to know what the big risks are and deal with them.
With time, technology spreads and globalization spreads capabilities. And as you argue in the book, the Americans won't be as powerful as they are now at the end of the century. How long do you see the American preeminence lasting?
It's not possible to look forward more than it's not even really possible to look forward a few decades. But I think on this sort of issue, it's hard to look forward. I think that American preeminence depends partly on the relative position of other countries, and it depends partly on the willingness of America to, as it were, behave preeminently. And I think one needs to examine both of those things. By and large, I think what's special about American preeminence is not so much the sheer measures of the difference between American power economically, militarily, culturally, scientifically with other countries, but rather, and this is going to come across to some people as a comment that ignores current affairs, but I still think it's true that actually by and large it's quite widely accepted, American preeminence. For all the anti-American noise that is around, the reality is that American preeminence is basically accepted. I think that as long as that stays, and we can discuss whether I'm right or not, but as long as that stays, then even as the gap between the United States and, for example, China, India, perhaps some of the other Asian countries, Brazil, narrows, as I hope it will, American leadership will remain intact. Whereas it's not a function, I think, of simply some sort of equation. It has a lot to do with acceptance of the basic direction that America leads the world in. But on the other hand, there is the American willingness to lead the world. And one of the doubts that one should have, and that I do explore to a degree in the book, is whether as this relative gap closes between America and the rest of the world, if American ideals of trade, market openness, democracy do spread and help other countries catch up, will Americans themselves get scared by the closing of the gap, as they did during the time in the 1980s with regard to Japan, during the time that you were kindly talking about when I was a correspondent there, and the great obsession was the closing of the gap with Japan and whether Japan would overtake. And indeed, the Reagan-era protectionism was a reaction to that. And that's one of my worries in the future, that Americans will not wish to accept such a closing of the gap.
Let's push the paranoid side of the paranoid optimist for a minute. When I wrote a little piece for you in The Economist about the future, it was titled "Beware of the New Barbarians," and I think you chose the title, or someone on your staff. But
I'll blame somebody else.
But the argument was that on the analogy that Rome didn't collapse because of the rise of another empire, but it collapsed from internal decay, which I don't think is the case, but from a series of death of 1,000 cuts from barbarians. To what extent does 9/11 signal that there could be a set of barbarians? I don't mean terrorists at the scale of what we've seen. I mean terrorists getting hold of weapons of mass destruction. So that instead of losing 2 towers, you lose the lower half of Manhattan, or the city of London, or the left bank of Paris. What happens to people's willingness to live in cities? What happens to urban real estate prices? What happens to all these things which we take for granted if that occurs? In other words, presumably that's part of the paranoia, but if you look forward into a century, as you're doing, you've given us the optimism. Tell us a little bit more about that paranoid side.
Well, I definitely think that a sequence of such attacks, as you say, in the heart of cities would seriously erode the confidence of whichever country it happened to. But I mean, let's say the hypothesis is that it's happening overwhelmingly to the United States. It would have, I think, a very strong effect on people's willingness to continue to engage in the rest of the world. I think we've seen with 9/11 that it increased Americans' willingness to engage. with the rest of the world. I should tell a story, by the way, that the week before 9/11, Dean Nye and Graham Allison hosted a lunch for me here, in which we discussed American power, and we talked about the future, and I went around the table saying, what do you think could bring this to an end? Or rather not bring it to an end, but change the direction. And both you, Joe, and Graham immediately said a major act of terrorism on American soil. And a few days later it happened. But what you said at the time I agreed with, which is that you felt that the effect of it would be to increase engagement with the rest of the world. Actually, not to lead Americans to hide away in the shell, but rather to go out. And I think that's been borne out by events. I would say that one of the paranoid possibilities would be that if this happened once a year, twice a year, even once every 2 years, that sort of devastating effect, that over a period, what you could call the bin Laden bet could come off. And that actually, faced with an inability to stop it, Americans might decide that the best thing to do would be to hide away from it. And I do think that it could go the other way. Now, my optimism, which is completely unprovable, is that I take the view that actually the violent terrorism of 9/11 and associated with it, rather as Gilles Kepel argues in his book on Islam, jihad, represents a peak rather than, and a desperate act during a period of decline of this sort of radicalism, rather than something that builds the radicalism. But that could be wrong. That's a hope rather than a clearly founded piece of analysis.
Well, since you were right once before, I hope you're right again. Let me ask you, though, about different perceptions in Europe and in the United States. One of the things that struck me at the World Economic Forum in Davos last week was a sense of pessimism that pervaded it, and also a sense of fatalism among Europeans about terrorism. There was a sense of, we've been through this, we know how to handle it, it's bound to happen. But the idea that there could be a increasing scale of terrorism, which would be very different from what we've seen in the past, was more prevalent among Americans than among Europeans. Obviously, 9/11 happened here, not there. But is it part of a larger difference of pictures of the world between Europe and America?
I find that this issue hard to judge, partly because I often feel that the little bit of Europe that I live in, namely the Economist building in St. James's Street, I'm not quite sure whether it's in Europe or America. In some ways, I feel detached from the continent that I'm part of, and therefore not a very dispassionate observer of European views. I think that Europeans really don't know what to think about this issue. Some Europeans don't take the idea of terrorism seriously. They think slightly complacently that we in Europe have gone through it before with the IRA, with the Basque separatists, with the Red Brigades in Italy. We've learned how to live with it, and this will be no different, and you Americans are making too much of it, if you like. Others, and so I really think that people are divided, both at an elite level and at public opinion level. Others are terrified that actually, no, this is different, and we could see a great upsurge of terrorism, no longer separatist terrorism when you understand the issue, but rather terrorism from within, from our large communities of Muslims in France, for example, in Italy, in Spain, in Britain, and that this is scaring people, and to some extent leading people to become peaceniks, if you like, as far as the Iraq issue is concerned and other issues of the war on terror, because they are afraid of sparking off their own trouble. Still others, like Tony Blair, conclude the opposite and say that no, this is absolutely a reason why we have to try and go out and deal with the problem. So I think Europe is pretty split on this, right. As was shown, I think, by the letter published in the Wall Street Journal and other publications last week from 8 heads of government in Europe that didn't include France and Germany.
Robert Kagan has made minor reputation by saying Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus. And The Economist had a very interesting article on this a couple of weeks ago, saying when you look at the public opinion polls, it's not quite true. But how true is it? I mean, there's something in it. How real are these splits in terms of Europeans and Americans?
Again, it's difficult to judge, I think. I tend to believe that, first of all, within Europe there's a split. The British and the French are the ones from Mars, really. And many others are from Venus. We tend to be somewhat more militarily inclined, rather proud to send our forces overseas. If you read British newspapers during what is likely to be the Second Gulf War, you'll be surprised to find that there's any Americans taking part. So that there is a sort of a strange tradition in Britain, I think. So there's that division between the British and the French on the one side and everyone else. But then there's a different division between America and Europe, which we highlighted in that article, which is, I think, a discomfort in Europe with moral language, with the sense of fights being between good and evil, and which, as is highlighted in those value surveys, a much less traditional, much less religious, less patriotic set of values in Europe that then starts to squirm in, people start to squirm in their seats when they see an American president talking about crusades, about good and evil, about axes of evil, about evil empires. This is nothing new. British press and the French press often ascribe it particularly to President Bush, but it really isn't anything new. But it does cause a certain discomfort in Europe. I would say in a way Europeans are more cynical about these things and therefore a bit alarmed by that kind of language. Now, again, Tony Blair is curiously un-European in that way. This is a Christian socialist who is even more ambitious in terms of international intervention and activism than is President Bush.
When Colin Powell spoke at the World Economic Forum, the former Archbishop of Canterbury got up and said, "Why is it that you Americans in this administration focus so heavily on your hard military power? Why don't you do more with your soft power of attracting other people?" Is that a prevalent view, that the Americans don't use their soft power adequately?
I think it probably is quite a widespread view, although you get contrary opinions which bemoan cultural influence and soft power in Europe. I mean, when Jose Bové throws a brick through a window of McDonald's, he's using hard power to compete with soft power.
Right.
And so I think that in that sort of broad cultural interpretation of soft power, there's actually a lot of resentment of American power. I think that basically people are right to be worried about the use of military power. And perhaps they're particularly worried when it's somebody else using it. And therefore they don't feel they've got a good handle on how it's going to be used and with what ultimate objective. And I've struggled with this in The Economist, actually, just because an appropriate role for a publication like ours is skepticism, is criticism, is an examination of really the motives of what's being done. And yet I felt that actually what's being done is the right thing. And therefore we've supported both the war on terror and now the war in Iraq. And yet I want to acknowledge always that to be worried about war, to be worried and suspicious when a government is contemplating military action is absolutely right and appropriate. You should be worried when your government's carrying a gun, seems to me.
And if you look ahead a decade or so on U.S.-European relations, there are some who argue that we're in the process of a continental drift, that the relations between Europe and America will be not hostile, but considerably more distant 10 years hence than they are now. There are others who say, well, no, we're going through something we've seen before. There were, after Suez, after the IMF deployment in the early 80s and so forth. There were these, in quotes, crises in the Atlantic. And then look, even after the Cold War, you find that NATO remains popular in almost all European capitals and is expanding and so forth. Are we seeing one of these cyclical changes, or are we seeing a secular trend of Europe and America drifting apart?
I think overwhelmingly, to me, the likelihood is that it's a cyclical event. Plainly, one of the reasons for paranoia is that if it's handled badly by the particular governments who are sitting in the places they are in this cycle, then you can turn a cyclical trend into a secular one by multiplying some of the resentments and difficulties. But I basically think that interests are still pretty much aligned. Values are pretty much aligned, as that article said, over a broad range of things, not in every respect, but they are. And perhaps what we're partly seeing is actually the problems that come when two powers are quite equal in some respects. I think there's a lot of exaggerated talk about American primacy. Economically, it's not true. Europe is just as powerful as America. And indeed, if you look at, we had a chart recently at the back of the magazine, the bit that one often doesn't get to, but which looked at growth rates during the 4 years, 1998 to 2002, not of GDP, which is what we all write about, where America was far faster than Europe, but GDP per head, so a measure of living standards. And there, actually, it was much more even, because America's had population growth, Europe has population stagnation. And so the lower GDP growth rates were actually bringing better living standards to Europeans than many of us lazy commentators who didn't look at these figures properly were writing. And so I think it's been exaggerated, the difference in GDP growth. But also the difference in economic power has been exaggerated by the dollar. It was true also with the yen-dollar imbalance in the 80s, when the yen was really rising towards the end. This made almost anything you looked at in Japan look like it was suddenly worth hugely more, and that the imperial palace was worth more than the state of California, and these sorts of comparisons were done. And Japan's economy looked like it was sort of gaining hugely in strength. A lot of it was to do with the cycles of currency markets. And with the dollar having fallen 20% against the euro, those numbers, if you look at them now, start not to show American primacy in quite the same way. The equilibrium level of primacy, if there is such a thing, would show a much more even balance between America and Europe in everything except military hardware.
I made a similar point at a breakfast in London a week ago, and Robert Wade of the LSE took strong exception, said that the Americans, in fact, are able to control globalization at the economic level, not just at the military level, and that the growing inequalities that we're seeing are going to have a very powerful effect. You published in The Economist an article that he did on inequality and all the difficulties of measuring it. But do you see a prospect that, and this will be the final exploration of optimism, that the growth of capitalism will run into a roadblock or a stumble as it did in 1914, and that basically inequalities will continue to grow, that we'll see something in the 21st century like we saw in the 20th century, where you had really a 50-year setback for economic globalization? Is that, I mean, as a challenge to your optimism, what odds would you put on something like that repeating?
I would put 10%,
10%.
Odds on that. In other words, it's a nightmare scenario. I think it doesn't feel as if it's a likely scenario, but it is absolutely possible. Globalization is reversible. And I doubt if it's going to come because of a reaction to inequality. I think it would be a reaction to conflict of some sort. That was arising for other reasons, and that as a result of the end of the conflict, countries started to look into themselves again, perhaps because they didn't feel a sense of trust in international relations and international affairs. I think the other observation I would make about inequality between countries is that what has been happening is that the range around the mean has been increasing, but the countries in the middle have as it were, been moving up. I mean, I don't mean therefore the arithmetic mean. I mean that the gap between America and some of the growing emerging markets has been narrowing. And indeed, on population terms, if you adjust Wade's figures to deal with the fact that China has got a lot of people in it, you see that in that sense, inequality in the world has been reducing in the last 15, 20 years, as it must have been given Chinese growth rates. But the gap between the richest and the poorest has been widening. Right. But I don't see how that really brings unstable political consequences. I mean, it's terrible for the people of Mali and Chad and the countries right at the bottom of the range, but the hard reality of life is that I don't see how it could sort of exert itself into international politics.
Mm-hmm. We've reached the halfway point of our hour, and let's throw it open now to the audience. You will find 2 microphones on the floor, 2 in the balconies there, and why don't you state your name and your affiliation with the university as you pose your question. And remember that questions are brief, end with a question mark, and come 1 per customer. So we'll start here.
Hi, I'm Joseph Konzelman. I'm an undergraduate, 3rd year from New Jersey. And my question is, why do you think Chirac threatened to veto the second Iraq resolution? And if he does, and we go to war, will that render the UN Security Council irrelevant, essentially?
I think that Chirac is unlikely to veto a second resolution. I think much depends on what Secretary Powell produces to the Security Council on Wednesday, and then what further information flow comes after that during the next few weeks. But I think France's choice is most likely to be between abstention and voting in favor. If I was to place a bet between the two, I would say I'd bet 60% in favor, 40% abstention. But obviously, I can't. That shows a lack of confidence in which way they're going to go. I think that France has particularly strong public opinion, skepticism about the war. I think that there's a consciousness of a large Muslim population in France, and the issue that Dina and I were talking about just now, about this sort of fear of terrorism. And I think that France feels that it's got relatively few cards to play in world affairs, and one of them is its reluctance to vote in the Security Council, and therefore it will use its cards for as long as it can. In the end, I think that if the case is made, basically the French share the view at an elite level about what needs to be done. They may dissent over the means and the exact methodology that's being followed, but they share the end. And that's why I think that basically they're likely to vote in favor. If they vetoed it, well, you know, the Security Council is never finished. I don't believe it would signal the end of the United Nations or the Security Council, but would clearly damage it for many years to come.
Thank you. Turn to the other mic on the floor.
Good evening. I'm Laura Sitia from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and my question is, well, I know neutrality and objectivity are supposed to be good qualities of journalism, but I think that in matters of life and death, we shouldn't afford to just report on things. So do you believe the Economist have a normative role, and where do you personally look for values when you report what's happening?
Well, first of all, I absolutely think that The Economist has a normative role. I mean, we've always aimed to be a journal of analysis that ended with a conclusion, that laid out the facts. The perfect Economist article lays out the facts so you can draw whatever conclusion you like, but then we tell you what we think. Now, I don't suggest that we achieve 100% perfection in The Economist, but that to me is the perfect article, where you have the information there on which you can base your own disagreeing view, but we still take you through an argument and a reasoning process and come up with a conclusion. And the important thing for the reader is that we make no secret of that. So we don't offer ourselves as a neutral, objective, straight reporting publication. We offer ourselves as an analytical journal of opinion on international affairs. And so readers know what they're getting. That's the important thing. Where do my values come from? Well, probably from Oxford. I don't know where they come from. An English liberal tradition, from the close reading of Adam Smith, from all of that, really. Thank you.
In the balcony.
Hi, my name is Rocky Whites. I'm a joint degree student at the Fletcher School as well as the Harvard Law School. My question involves the role of NATO and the U.S. relations with it. It seems that NATO has been less interested to participate in a major way in the war on terrorism, especially in Afghanistan, and as well as the potential second Gulf War. How would you recommend that the U.S. try to harness NATO in those roles? And if it's successful in doing so, how will that help America's role as this, or NATO, could it do it in a way that would make NATO this organization that helps maintain peace in the world? Thanks.
Thank you. I'm not a defense specialist, and therefore I find this topic curious, really, in a way. I don't see why NATO has to be involved all the time in order to continue to have a function. Plenty of people have written that after Article 5 of NATO was invoked, after 9/11, and the other members of NATO expressed a willingness to stand by the United States, that they then resented not being invited to do so and take part in the Afghan war as a NATO operation. I think that that's exaggerated. I think, yes, a few countries maybe took a little bit knock on their pride. Their offers weren't enthusiastically taken up. But it doesn't seem to me that NATO is particularly brilliantly fitted for going out and fighting a conflict in Central Asia. I think perhaps to make itself more usable in future, it needs to fit itself in that way. And the European members of NATO in particular need to think hard about their defense spending and how they manage their defense spending and how they manage it to maintain interoperability with American forces. We in Europe just spend too little on defense. And I think that the real way to get NATO well used and vigorous for the future is to spend more on defense and be more capable so that we can engage in operations. Now, Kosovo was a NATO operation. Afghanistan wasn't. The first Gulf War wasn't a NATO operation, neither will the second one be. Does that mean that NATO's finished? I don't think so. I think that NATO is there and usable in future operations, but only as long as our defense spending justifies it.
Left balcony.
Thank you. My name is Adam Scheuer. I'm a freshman undergraduate. I read in your magazine this week that Donald Rumsfeld said that he considered another terrorist attack on U.S. soil inevitable. So with that in mind, firstly, how could, or what's the likelihood that a war in Iraq could prompt more terrorist attacks at home? And secondly, if that's in the short term, how could that affect public support and popularity for the war in Iraq?
Thank you. I think that there's two layers to the possibility. One is that in a war in Iraq, terrorism could be used as a tactic by Saddam Hussein. And second, the second layer, which I think is a separate issue, is whether or not resentment of military action in Iraq and conceivably resentment later of occupation of Iraq could stimulate other radical groups to take out terrorist acts. The first of those issues I just find almost impossible to evaluate. I don't know what Saddam Hussein's tactics are going to be. I think that he would be capable of using them. I think that he would probably calculate that they would strengthen, as it were, directly, these are direct tactical uses of terrorism, that would actually reinforce American public support for military action against him, and that it would actually make his task harder in pulling things to a stalemate, if you like, if that's his objective in a war, rather than easier. So that would, if I was trying to do his calculation for him, that's how I would think about it. But I find it pretty hard to get inside his mind. So, so I'm not sure that I'm good at emulating his rationality. As far as the danger of it stimulating terrorist attacks by other radical groups, I think that depends on how long it goes on. I think it's pretty unlikely that it will do immediately. I don't think that it sort of suddenly sparks off terrorist attacks by others. But I think if you get heavy civilian death, if it's a long drawn-out war, yes, you could provoke, I think, in time, some terrorist acts by other radical groups. Yes, I do think that that's possible. This word inevitable is used a lot. Tony Blair said that recently that a terrorist attack in Britain is inevitable. I don't know quite what they mean, really. I mean, I guess they mean we've got to be prepared in case it happens. But I doubt. I mean, my final answer really is that, on balance, I doubt if there's a clear, close link between the war in Iraq and the likelihood of sort of messianic terrorism, as I like to call it, in Britain, France, or the United States. I think that the war in Iraq won't make it either likelier or less likely, actually.
Left floor.
Hi, my name is Dan Obis. I'm also a freshman at the college. Many opponents of the war in Iraq claim that Bush's primary motive is to control the Iraqi oil fields. And I'm wondering how valid an evaluation of American motives do you think that is?
I don't understand this theory, really, to be honest. First of all, I don't understand what benefit it would be to America to control these oil fields. Would this be to lower the price or raise it? Which constituency within the United States would dominate on that? I can't see that. I think that a basic way to understand the role of oil in the Iraq situation is that oil matters to the extent that a proper and valid objective of the United States has been to prevent a genocidal, ambitious dictator getting control of a dominant share of the world's energy supplies, which is what he would have done had he got Kuwait and then Saudi Arabia. So that it's, I think, absolutely in all our interest to prevent him from doing that. But has it been bad for the United States that Iraqi oil production has been low during the last 10 years particularly? I don't think so. There's actually a surplus of oil in the world. I don't think it could be analyzed as being either good or bad. So I think this is a false conclusion, and I think it's overwhelmingly likely that as quickly as possible, an occupying American force will hand over the oil fields to a new Iraqi regime, precisely because of the rather sort of sensitive nature of that accusation. I think it's false, but it is clearly an explosive sort of accusation, and therefore I think the aim will be to stand back as quickly as possible.
There was a good article on this in The Economist about a week ago.
I read it.
Thank you for being here tonight. I meant to ask you a more of a journalistic question, but just to follow up on what you said.
Introduce yourself, please.
I'm sorry, I'm Nadia Krisen from the Fletcher School. When you talk to your team, to your journalist at The Economist, and you guys ask yourself, why is President Bush willing to go to war? What's the most common answer that you get from your team as well as from yourself? My journalistic question comes to you. To what extent do you think the reporting on a potential second war with Iraq will be different from the first Gulf War? Are you worried of not having enough access to information? What's your feeling on that? So if you could answer that would be great.
Thank you, yes. I mean, the first thing to say for everyone's benefit is that we operate The Economist by spirited discussion and debate, and we have very spirited discussions and debates about the war in Iraq. And I've never taken a vote because it seems to me that that would be a bad idea. But I don't know whether I would win it within The Economist staff. I know I would win it with my senior colleagues, but I don't know actually whether I would win it among the whole staff if we had a secret ballot, shall we say. We have real divisions over this issue. It's a difficult issue, and we have repeated discussions about it. I think that the basic case for war in Iraq is that the alternative is worse, which, namely, the alternative is either continuing containment of this brutal, genocidal, ambitious dictator, a containment which is itself causing grievances because of the bases in Saudi Arabia and because of the sanctions and the effect of it on the Iraqi people, and meanwhile not, I believe, preventing him from continuing his weapons programs. So that, I think the status quo is untenable, and it makes life harder in the rest of the Middle East as well, in sorting out Israel and the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Ultimately, why contain him at all? Why deal with him at all? It's because he showed a clear ambition to develop the worst weapons in the world and to use them to dominate the region, as well as to kill his own people. But the crucial thing from this purpose is he wanted to use them to dominate the region. I feel that he should be stopped from doing that. I also think that when there have been 17 UN resolutions and a whole set of series of inspections efforts that have gone on over 12 years now, that actually that's a pretty good long process to have gone through, and that you need to do something to defend the United Nations and international law. The final part of your question was, am I worried about lack of information? I think that's less of a problem for me than it is for a daily newspaper or a broadcasting operation. You know, basically, The Economist can cover the war by watching CNN and the BBC and reading the newspapers and having our own briefings in London and in Washington and elsewhere. We don't need to be right on the front line. And I think it would probably be irresponsible of me to ask my journalists to go onto the front line because it's a dangerous place to be, and you shouldn't take that risk lightly. So I'm not too worried about it, actually. I also think that there will be a lot of information coming through about certain things, but you won't have absolutely panoramic information, and that can be the problem of interpretation.
Right, Balcony.
Good evening. My name is Kevin Allison, and I'm a second-year student at the Kennedy School. After Iraq, the attention of the international community will most likely focus on a potentially more ominous situation brewing in the Korean Peninsula. With the North Korean regime possibly already in possession of nuclear weapons, and with so many thousands of troops within striking distance of Seoul, our position in negotiating a solution to this problem seems far less advantageous. How do you think the international community can negotiate with Kim Jong-il or otherwise persuade him to give up his nuclear ambitions without resorting to appeasement?
Incredibly difficult question, no doubt about it. And what we clearly mainly need to know is what do the Chinese and what do the Russians think about this, and what leverage are they willing and able to use on Kim Jong-il in persuading him to back down. And that's going to be the important exploratory process, it seems to me. I'm sitting next to an expert on this issue, so I speak nervously. But it seems to me that that's going to be one of the crucial parts. I suppose in the end, I suspect that Kim Jong-il is also not suicidal, and that he is a bargainer. And you're right that appeasement is a difficult side of that potential bargain, but I suspect that he can be persuaded to actually give up and to allow back inspectors in. It will be a form of blackmail, but I suspect that I guess that's what the negotiators are going to have to believe in the end, that he's not suicidal and he's not actually willing to take out, implement his ultimate threat. But I think as before, as in 1994, it's going to be a fine decision as to what balance between diplomacy and hard power to use.
I knew the answer to this, but I forgot. Left balcony.
My name is Mathieu Lefebvre. I'm from France, and despite the special treatment your magazine reserves to my country, I admire it very much. And I try not to make an opinion about any topic unless I see a good Economist cover. And one topic that you haven't made your mind up on, it seems, is the European currency. Could you tell us what the debate is within the magazine?
Yeah. I think we have made up our mind about it, actually. But anyway, let me tell you first of all that we have more readers in France than we do in Germany, which means that we have actually a considerably higher readership per head of population in France than we do in Germany, which I am very proud of and delighted by. The single currency we were in favor of even before it was launched, particularly because we thought that it was a good way of dealing with sort of inflationary tendencies in European economies that have been shown over the last 3 or 4 decades. We were in favor of it. We wished it well when it was launched. We criticized its design. We think that the Stability and Growth Pact, limiting fiscal deficits very tightly as it is, makes no economic sense. And that if you are making rigid monetary policy from the point of view of each national economy within a large economic environment like the European Union, that you should actually allow plenty of flexibility on the fiscal side, and that market methods through credit risk and differential bond rates could deal with the worry about the free rider issue of and it's always Italy that is cited on this case. I'm not anti-Italian, but everyone always cites Italy as being the country that was liable to overborrow, and I think that could be dealt with through the credit market. So I think the Stability Pact was a bad idea. So we were against that aspect of the single currency. Now, the reason you think that we haven't made up our minds is because we haven't said that sterling should join the single currency. And it seems to me as an international publication rather than just a British publication, I can be both simultaneously in favor of the single European currency, critical of its design, and negative about whether a particular currency, namely the British currency, should join it. I don't think the dollar should join the euro either. So the question is, as you move away from the central core of the West European economy, should every currency have to join the single currency? I think not. I think that the British economy and the European economies have operated in quite different ways, particularly in the way interest rates have operated, and the role of interest rates in the British housing market is different. And that you do need more convergence economically between them before it was going to be viable. I think that Britain was right not to join at launch in 1999, and then, having not joined then, the right policy, I think, is to leave the euro to mature through an economic cycle, which is not there yet, particularly since British public opinion is so strongly against that. If Britain was to join it, you need a politically sustainable, a politically credible decision to join it, and you're really climbing uphill in Britain as far as that's concerned. So I think that Britain will join and should join the single currency eventually. I would suggest that will happen within the next 5 years. I would not predict that it's likely to join this year, although I think that there is still a possibility that that Tony Blair will call a referendum this year. I'm in quite a small minority in believing that still. But I think there's a possibility he will, but he'll lose it, probably by a relatively narrow amount, which will empower him to hold another one within a few years. So that's my complex position on the single currency.
Left floor.
Hi, I'm Susan Cardos. I'm a doctoral student education policy here at the Ed School at Harvard. And you can answer this question in any framework that is most comfortable for you.
This chair is good.
As Americans, we've spent the last year and a half searching for things, searching for air pockets in the rubble of Ground Zero, and searching for Osama and Elizabeth Smart and Lacey Peterson and 9 miners in Pennsylvania, and now the wreckage of the Columbia. And I wonder, from your perspective, what is it, do you think, that we as Americans should really be searching for?
That's a very, very profound question that I don't know that I'm up to answering it. I mean, I think that there are mostly individual answers to that. I think that answering such a question about a country, about a nation, is much harder. I don't know what British should be searching for either. I think that Americans should seek to use their preeminence in the world, both through, as John Foster Dulles, I think it was, said, by conduct and example, by conduct that that does seek to right some wrongs and to deal with some trouble spots around the world, but also by example through the openness of the society, through the rule of law, through the openness to immigration, and I think now quite pertinently by a continued faith in justice in dealing with human rights issues. If you look at America since 9/11, I greatly admire the resolute, determined conduct of the war in Afghanistan and the willingness now to try to deal with Saddam Hussein. What worries me more has been the conduct of the war on terrorists in terms of the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, in terms of perhaps the torture methods. We had this on the cover of The Economist recently with, I think, a pretty good piece about it. Both possibly the use of torture within the American system, but also the condoning of the use of torture by other countries as partners of the United States. I think that is a very difficult issue and undermines the values that America stands for in terms of rule of law and human rights and freedoms, and that worries me. So that's a rather rambling answer to a very deep question.
Right side of the floor.
Hi, my name is Deborah Kaufman, and I have no affiliation with this university. I'm at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. I'm a graduating senior in English and political science. My question goes back to something that you mentioned earlier when you first started your talk, and that was the preeminence of America. And you mentioned this as a positive aspect. There's even a level of comfort with the preeminence of American leadership. I wonder if you could just quantify that a little bit. This is very interesting to me as a European. You would express this point of view. I don't know if you specifically, you can take this personal if you want, but why are you comfortable with the Americans being in the driver's seat as a European? Can you be more specific? Are you comfortable particularly with this administration in light of that larger question? I'm just curious if you can kind of quantify that original statement. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I don't think of America as being in the driving seat exactly. I mean, I talk in the book, I prefer to think of America as a sort of elder brother. I don't have an elder brother. I am an elder brother myself. And I think my younger brother resents me from time to time and dislikes things I say to him and do to him and all this sort of thing. But I hope, basically, he thinks that I would come and sort things out for him and help him with family problems, help him with difficulties that he gets into. And I think that that's part of what I think people do see positively in the United States. I think that for all the accusations about that it's all about oil or that America's a bully and so forth, I think that more people in the countries I go to basically feel that America probably has the right intentions when it engages overseas militarily or otherwise, than think that it has bad intentions. They may often criticize the methods. They may feel that they're clumsy or badly thought through or whatever, all sorts of lines of criticism, but basically they feel some trust in America's intentions, partly because it doesn't have a track record as a colonial and imperial power and a kind of directly repressive power, unlike my own country. And therefore they think that in the end it's not actually going to stay there and rule over them. Partly also because of the sorts of values of democracy, of the rule of law, of justice that are dominant in this country. Second, I think in this relatively positive view of America, I think that you've got to understand the ambivalence that people feel. In an article I wrote for The Economist, I don't think I cited it in the book, but there's a Congress Party politician from India called Jairam Ramesh who did a very nice monograph for the, I'm doing the monologue, for the Asia Society at the time of Bill Clinton's visit to India. And I loved the title of it. It was about US-India relations, and the title was Yankee Go Home and Take Me With You. And I thought that really captured where the ambivalence of a society like India, actually, about the United States. Everyone who wanted to come here to Harvard, they wanted all the soft power of the universities, of working in America, of many of the things that are so positive about this country. And yet, they probably didn't want Coca-Cola to be sold. They were sort of fighting with themselves in a way about the American presence in their own country, and have a sense of pride at India's adoption, taking up of the nuclear bomb and so forth. I think there's an ambivalence, but the positive, to my judgment, outweighs the negative, and that's the power, the soft power of the United States.
We could go on all evening, but Bill has a television appointment that he has to appear at, so we're going to have to release him at this point. But I should tell you that any question you had that hasn't been answered, it's right in here. In any case, Bill, we thought this was a fascinating evening. We've only begun a longer conversation. We'll read our Economist, read the book, and welcome you back anytime. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
Good. That was fun.
That was great fun.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
I know, I thought you might want to talk about it. What does he see to me sort of alternative to that ideology? Are there any? Yeah, I love communism.